So I'd like to welcome you to this week's Common Book Speaker Series. We have Andrea Connor, our own CCBC own Associate Professor of Social Work. She's been teaching at CCBC since 2006, full-time since 2008, teaching classes in sociology and social work. And I welcome her today.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. It's really a pleasure to be here today for our folks who are joining us remotely, my students who are in our classroom, hence our social distancing requirements, and for folks who may be listening to the recording after the fact. It's been a real honor to be asked to participate in in the series that Sarah has organized this year. Mental health is definitely my life's work. Is someone talking? I feel like Oh, okay. That's over on our end. We've got a student that's going to take care of the doorway. Sorry about that if there was some background noise there. Sometimes we've got to work out the kinks. But again, just a big thanks to Sarah for the wonderfully diverse speaker series that she has developed for this year, and also for allowing me to talk about what really has been my professional passion my whole life, and the topic of mental health. So Sarah has been kind enough to allow me to be able to screen share, and I'm going to do that. I have a little PowerPoint that I'm going to share with all the attendees today. And also, just to give people a heads up, questions and comments are more than welcome. We are in one of our flex classrooms, which are wonderful because it allows for this sort of scenario for us to do the live audience both on campus and remotely, and also to record. Although sometimes the sound in this specific room doesn't come in very well. So Sarah, if you can help me out there, if I'm not hearing things, I would be very, very appreciative. Okay, well, I'm going to screen share here. If you can be patient with me just for a minute. I know when I screen share, we always move to this little kind of, I call it the infinity feature. I don't know what my colleagues call it, but that's what I call it. And I'm going to move on to the PowerPoint that I wanted to share today. And obviously, today, this month, we're looking at issues related to mental health. And so I thought it was important to just stick with some of the basics about understanding mental health, awareness of mental health, and also to talk about hope, because hope is a very big component, at least in my mind, when we're talking about the topic of mental health. And obviously, for the past year, the topic that all of us have been hearing about and basically living with has been the COVID-19 situation. And this morning in the Atlantic, I saw an article about the fact that 1 in 3 Americans knows someone that was lost to COVID. And I think that's a pretty staggering statistic over our life experience the past year. And while COVID has been the topic that's kind of been on all of our minds this past year, we have to remember that the challenges of life go back far in history. And so there have been other epidemics and pandemics, but also common life experiences. Things like natural and man-made disasters like Chernobyl or Hurricane Katrina, and also events that are related to war and terrorism, such as 9/11. So while COVID has been a unique experience to those of us who have been surviving the COVID pandemic for the past year, through our overall human history, the skills and the experiences of surviving a difficult situation are not necessarily foreign to us. Then again, while COVID has been a global pandemic, we know that we're all individuals and that each of us have had our own difficulties and stresses can be related to the past year and to the COVID situation. So how do we care for ourselves? And what about the folks who we care about or care for? What are some of the most basic kind of topics that we can address along those lines? So we're going to talk about these three topics, understanding, awareness, and hope today. And we're going to start first with understanding. First of all, what is mental health? We all talk about it all the time, but for many of us, we might not actually know what that definition is. And mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make healthy choices. Mental health is important at every stage of life, from childhood and adolescence through adulthood, and indeed through the end of life. Mental health, just like our physical health, our existence is a cradle to grave experience. Now, that's how we talk about mental health, but what about mental illness? Now, mental illnesses are conditions that affect a person's thinking, feeling, mood, or behavior. Some examples are depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. There are conditions that may be occasional, but there are other conditions that are long-lasting or chronic and affect someone's ability to relate to others and function each day. And so I think as we look at these, we have to see, even when we talk about, okay, we have mental health, we have mental illness, but then at the same point in time, when we talk about mental illness, there's great variation in our experiences of it. Technically, when we look at a more chronic situation, we're going to look at the persistence and the severity of symptoms. Just because you have a bad day or a bad couple of days, you're having a bad day or a bad couple of days. But when we start to look at the duration of symptoms, are they lasting for typically 2 weeks or more, and the severity of the symptoms? That's when we get a better idea about the significance of the situation that an individual might be experiencing. And then you put on top of that the concept of COVID, which has been the life that we all have been living the past year. And we're looking at not just society, but a global population where everyone for the past year has been living with a chronic social condition in the form of the pandemic. And for some people, that may have been more difficult than others. Let's look a little bit at some of the facts about mental illness, now that we've defined it. One of the things I'd like to say about both mental illness and substance abuse is that they are equal opportunity employers. They don't really care about your income level or your racial identity or your sexual orientation or your gender identity. They are an equal opportunity employer. And we know that here in the United States, over the course of their lifetime, probably more than 50% of individuals will be diagnosed with some sort of mental disorder. Now, oftentimes that might be one that's more acute or brief in nature, such as a life transition or bereavement regarding a loss. Other times individuals will suffer from or be diagnosed with a more chronic condition that might require lifetime treatment and management, such as schizophrenia. In addition to mental illness, we also know that over the course of the lifetime, 50% of families will have a family member that has been diagnosed with or is experiencing an issue with addiction. So we can see that if these are things that are happening to us or to people we care about, it's fairly common. You're talking about practically half of the United States at some point in their life are going to have a family member, if not themselves, that are dealing with these issues. We know that 1 in 5 Americans will experience a mental illness in a given year. 1 in 5 children, either currently or at some point during their life, have had a serious debilitating mental illness. And 1 in 25 Americans live with a serious mental illness, those chronic conditions such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or recurrent major depression. We also know that when we talk about mental illness historically, that mental illness has been subjected to stigmas, prejudice, a lack of understanding, discrimination. Individuals or families often feel shame or guilt about a family member that has a mental illness or is battling an addiction. So one of the things about COVID is COVID has made mental illness and addiction a more daily and common topic in our communities, in the media, everywhere you look. There's been a lot of discussion about the impact of COVID on mental illness. And we know that when we are talking about awareness and the impact of COVID-19 on mental health and mental health awareness, there are pros and cons. There's been challenges and there's been opportunities. And before we talk about the challenges and opportunities, I'm going to screen share here, but I'm going to stop screen sharing just for a minute, actually. And I know I have students here in the classroom, but do people feel that that resonates with them a little bit? The idea that there's been some things that have been hard or challenging emotionally or psychologically, but there's been other things that have been a little bit more positive out of the situation. I'm going to pick on my students here in class, and you folks are welcome to add to the chat board or discussion if you would like. Is anybody here willing to throw out something that's been a challenge? Leanne?
In terms of just this last year with the COVID, or like
overall? The past year with mental health in general.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Is there something specific that you can identify?
Well, I was diagnosed with some cognitive disorders, but they are not they're not dementia or Alzheimer's related. My neurologist seems to think that it's anxiety.
Anxiety. Yeah. Okay. Yes, Rachel.
Well, I was diagnosed with anxiety, not during the pandemic, I was beforehand, but like with that, I'm someone that needs like distraction, like to be with people and to like see my friends like constantly to kind of just like, you know, so you're not like alone with your thoughts and go like crazy basically. And I think that affected a lot of people, and like I know that a lot of more people were diagnosed with depression or anxiety during this because we need social interaction. That's what the human nature is. Like we need that interaction with other people to stay sane, basically.
Right. Yes, Joe.
I think the biggest factor here is isolation because, you know, a lot of people that are quarantining, they're getting just alone with their thoughts. Like I know some people that have been trying to quit addictions like cigarettes, and they're just alone with their thoughts. They're like, oh, I might as well, and they give into that pressure.
Right. I'd really like to thank the feedback that I've gotten from some of the folks in the classroom. And two of the real important points that were established were one student identified the identification of new symptoms or a new diagnosis, and another student had identified already having symptoms or diagnosis and then needing to continue to manage that through a difficult situation. And finally, a third student had talked about the issue of access and how COVID, if you need support, if you need treatment, how COVID has compromised that. So I like to try to make things interactive. So for those of you joining us online, thanks for allowing me to kind of go live and move from the PowerPoint temporarily. I'm going to move back to the PowerPoint now and continue on. And obviously, when we talk about challenges and opportunities, some of them we've already looked at. You know, we've looked at the ideas of having new symptoms or experiencing symptoms for the first time as a result of the prolonged stress of the COVID epidemic. We have all had to make lifestyle changes to varying degrees. Even the fact that we go to work or go to school wearing a mask, if that's the only thing that you have had to adjust to, that's probably more minimal. For many people, it's been seeing family members, having family members become ill, or perhaps they've become ill, the threat of the job loss, all sorts of different things. We know that for our challenges, we are dealing with situations where if we are having new symptoms, how do I go about getting services for that at a time when perhaps services aren't always accessible? If I'm already in treatment, how do I maintain those services? When the first few weeks, the first few months of the pandemic, oftentimes people could not get any of the services they need, both for medical and for mental conditions. So there was definitely access issues. At the same point in time, we know that there have been a lot of opportunities. I think one of the silver linings to the COVID cloud has been just the heightened awareness about the fact that people have mental health issues. People have substance abuse issues. This is part of what happens to some individuals or some families in our society, and people need services to help with these needs. There's been a decreased stigma because as a result of the pandemic, we know that more people who perhaps weren't experiencing mental health issues or issues with addiction began to, because of the stress of the situation, because of the prolonged effect of the high level of stress from all of the different worries that people might have had. So pretty much you can't really go anywhere without getting information or resources. It's on the television, it's on the radio. You know, I'm old school. I know you guys who are only use your phones and your social media. Everything is about, are you having these issues, where you can go, it's okay. So I think that's been the silver lining, not that we've had a pandemic or not that people are having these issues that need attention, but that the stigma has decreased, there's awareness about the frequency, there's information about how and where to go for help. And the expanded resources electronically. I know that even when you think not just about mental health and substance abuse, but when you think about even doctor appointments, the pandemic encouraged or pushed the idea that we can do things like we're doing today. We can do things electronically. We can do things remotely. The idea of having a Zoom session with a therapist that probably existed previously, but most of the therapists I know weren't doing Zoom sessions a year ago or a year and a half ago. And now that definitely has to be an option, which allows for access. We know that that can help with access, and that can help people get the resources that they need. So it's been sort of a two-sided sword. But again, going back to some of the challenges of COVID, for those of you going back to your psychology, you know, we have Maslow's hierarchy. And Maslow says, you know, when our very basic needs, our psychological and our safety needs are not being met, it's really hard for us to focus on much more. So if we're worried about getting sick, or if we're worried about perhaps risk-taking behavior that we think our parents or grandparents are taking because maybe they're high risk and they don't want to socially distance, or they don't want to get a vaccine, or we're worried about losing our job, or you know, we have children and we're trying to do our job while they're sitting at the table trying to do their schoolwork. You know, all those things about how we're going to pay the rent and are we going to have money for food. It's really hard to think much beyond that, but that also means our stress level becomes increasingly more, it increases, and at the same point in time, it's prolonged. we have events that are acute that happen to us. Acute event is, maybe there's a snowstorm or a hurricane and you lose power and things are not so good for a couple days, but then that's over and then things go, you get your power back on, you get your house repaired, you go back to work and things go back to the way they were probably before the situation. When you look at a chronic situation, such as how much our life has changed in the past year, and the fact that there's still a fair amount of unknown about what we might be like in 6 months or even 3 months, that is kind of the chronic effect of stress and how that can impact us. And obviously, stress is a major factor in our mental health issues as well as our issues of substance use and abuse. So how do we move forward? How do we think about everything that we or our family members or friends are going through or have been going through? Well, one of the cornerstones of being a good clinician is displaying hope and hopefully helping individuals and families to have a sense of hope. So when I was a clinician, I had a wonderful mentor, and his name was Tim. One of the things that we knew with both mental health and substance abuse issues was that you don't need to have COVID around to have to deal with the obstacle of denial. Denial is one of the hugest obstacles in our lives. And when we would do group therapy together, Tim used to actually use a children's story. And it's called There's No Such Thing as a Dragon. It's a story by Jack Kent. And this is a lovely little story if you're familiar with it. And it talks, there's a little boy in the story, and he wakes up one morning and he's got a little dragon on his bed. And he takes it down to the breakfast table and says to his family, "Hey, look, I got a dragon." And the family says, "There's no such thing as a dragon." Well, then the next day, the dragon kind of takes up his whole bedroom. And he takes it down to breakfast again, and it's like kind of taking up the whole space in the dining room. And he says, "Hey, look, I got a dragon." And the family says, "There's no such thing as a dragon." And the story progresses, and then it finally gets to the point where the dragon is so big, it is, as you can see, not just taking up the whole house, but it's consuming the whole house plus beyond the house. And it wakes up and it starts running down the street with the house. And the family finally acknowledges that there's a dragon. And once they can acknowledge that there's a dragon, the dragon in the story, magically through the beauty of the artwork of the author, becomes small sized again. And he can hold it. And the dragon doesn't go away, but it becomes less of something that's just going to run off with the family home. And so Tim and I used to use this story to illustrate to our groups how when we deny our symptoms, when we deny that perhaps we have a need to address some of our mental health issues or substance use or abuse issues, that it can control and overtake our lives. And in fact, not just our lives, but the lives of our families. For those of you who have had the opportunity to read the common book, read Mary Lou is Everywhere, there's actually a very, an example that resonates with that in the book when Virgil teaches Cindy where to locate Bernadette's alcohol and how to get rid of it. And Virgil tells Cindy how Alistair, who was Bernadette's former husband, taught him how to do it. So there's this continuation of, okay, we're just going to keep trying to control this situation. Perhaps Bernadette needed some treatment for her drinking instead of everybody hiding the alcohol and disposing of it when they found it. Now, obviously, that was just a little example from the book, but I thought it illustrated well this idea of we have to accept that there is a pandemic. We have to accept that as much as we might want things to go, quote unquote, back to the way they were or normal, that whatever evolves will be whatever evolves. People have to accept perhaps or acknowledge that they have mental health symptoms that should be addressed, or that they or a family member have a substance use or abuse issue that should be addressed. Is it a quick fix? No, but it's a start. And when denial can be addressed, then people can have hope. The problem is sometimes, oftentimes, that it's not always an easy road. It's not a light switch that you can just flip off and on. And so oftentimes people have what we call all or nothing thinking. Either I'm sick or I'm well. Either I'm drinking or I'm not drinking. Either I'm using or I'm not using. And the reality is recovery and health is a journey. It's a process. And some days are more difficult than others. We're a little easier on people when they're recovering from something, let's say a broken leg, okay? So the doctor said, you can use your crutches for 6 weeks. And then after 6 weeks, we want you on a walking cast. And then, at 12 weeks, we want you to go into physical therapy. And physical therapy is going to have these specific steps that you are supposed to achieve. Because we can actually see that the person has a cast on their leg. But with mental health issues, with substance abuse issues, we can't always see that cast. We can't always see that burden. We can't always see the challenges that that individual or that family are dealing with. And so we have to talk about not just addressing our mental health and drug and alcohol concerns. We have to look at this recovery process. We have to allow for recovery. We have to allow for healing. When we look at the economy, and I know one of my students here, Rachel, that's her area of expertise. When we talk about the economy, we know the economy has ups and downs. We know there are depressions and recessions, and we know that people who follow the fiscal happenings of our world don't necessarily expect a recovery from a recession or a depression in one day. It's a process. And they know that even as things start to improve, there's going to be fluctuations. Such is the same with our mental health. Such is the same with individuals who are coping with substance abuse issues. And so we have to try to move away from that all or nothing thinking. We have to coexist. We gather today, for better or for worse, a group of individuals who have survived the year of a pandemic. When my older two were teenagers, they used to watch this show on TV, Survivor. Nobody ever really comes out of it, I don't think, looking good. They look rather beat up, rather emaciated. They've had to do some difficult things. And I think perhaps I like to use the word coexisting a little bit better. But then, when we talk about the denial and all the things about hope and acceptance, we have to empower ourselves and our family members. And anybody that has worked with a 12-step program or recovery groups, they oftentimes use a serenity prayer. We want individuals to, accept the things they cannot change. We cannot change that it's a pandemic. Have the courage to change the things you can. Are there things that you can change right now? Sure. But then also the wisdom to know the difference between the two. Now, I don't know about you folks, but I always get stuck on the wisdom, okay? Knowing the difference between the two. You think you get better at it, but it really is a challenge. But it is something for us to think about. Again, the theme today about COVID and our mental health over the past year and to the future. What things can I change? What things can't I change? And I have to go back to my dear mentor, Tim, and when we would do groups together, especially on bereavement or loss, he always would refer to Gibron's The Prophet. If any of you are familiar with it, it was the classic. It was printed in 1923. And he would always refer to the portion on joy and sorrow. And he talked about, he would always read the one segment that some of you say joy is greater than sorrow, and others say, nay, sorrow is the greater. But I say unto you, they are inseparable. Together they come, and when one sits alone with you at your board, remember that the other is asleep with you upon your bed. Coexisting and still living through sometimes what are difficult times. Humans have an amazing capacity for resiliency. We are a long line of people who have survived difficult times. It does not mean that they did not have difficulties and obstacles. It means the power of healing is pretty amazing in all of us, but that also involves accepting and accepting that life still happens during COVID. I know it's probably easy for a lot of us to think about things we missed out on the past year. My daughter missed her graduation from Pitt, and now she's getting ready to graduate with her master's degree from Syracuse, and she's still going to miss that. And people miss, funerals and weddings, but people also got, grandchildren and still went on with their life in other ways too. And I always think of that, the scales of justice kind of symbol when I think about this joy and sorrow and about this coexisting. So, what about wellness and self-care? Well, we could do a whole class on how to take care of ourselves, but, we're in a technologically sophisticated society. You don't need me to give you details on anything that you can locate online, but I think there are just some basic guidelines that can be helpful to all of us. Manage stress, easier said than done, right? I mean, here we are, the middle of the day in April for our students and faculty. We're coming up on the end of the school year. People are thinking, I got to go to work, I got to pick up my kid, we got to manage our stress. Practice mindfulness. Mindfulness is about being in the moment, okay? Too often we're thinking about what we should have done, what should have happened, or we're worried about what would happen, what could happen, what might happen. Just try to be in the moment. Be physically active. Plan pleasant activities. Don't be like me. I'm guilty of this. I will go have coffee with my sister-in-law when all my papers are graded and my house is clean and the laundry is done. I have 4 kids. Never going to happen, right? So plan pleasant activities. Eat a nutritious diet. Caffeine, chocolate, cigarettes, fast food. That's really not a nutritious diet. Seek and follow the recommendations of medical and treatment professionals as appropriate for both physical and psychological health. Connect with others via support groups. Practice self-compassion. Remember to be kind to yourself. Most of the time, most of us are probably our own worst enemy. Set limits. It's okay to say no. And if all else fails, just remember to breathe. It's amazing how many sayings and phrases we have in our society that are related just to the ability to breathe, but also reflect our emotional state. The phrases such as, it's suffocating me. I'm holding my breath, waiting for what's going to happen. Or life is so crazy, I just need to catch my breath. Sometimes just remind yourself, stop and breathe. I know that sounds pretty simple, but it actually does help. So, and I'm laughing because I had to do it to myself this morning. I got in my car and everything is different. The windows are all open, the moonroof's open, my granddaughter's baby seat's all a mess. because my two youngest kids were home from college and that's how they left it. And I started getting tense and I said, just take a breath and be glad they came to visit you. So I kind of had to stop myself because it could have easily ended up into a stressful situation. And I think sometimes we just have to do that. The last thing I always like to leave people with is resources. Every good social worker doesn't let their client leave the office empty-handed. And I'm giving a list here of some of the more reputable resources. If you need information, the CDC, the National Institute on Mental Health, also the local Beaver County site, which has local links, those of you who are Beaver County residents, for drug and alcohol services, mental health services. Also, of course, if you have elderly family members or friends that you're concerned about, there are links there. NAMI, okay, and NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And the last link I have is actually something that prior to COVID, when we actually did workbooks and things like that, there's actually really a great stress management workbook. It's actually put out by the VA. I really like it because it has a collection of different activities, and I always recommend that people go through and find the things that work for you, because what works for you might not work for everybody else, or what works for you today might not work for you a year from now. I think it's just good to have some resources available. So if you are not interested in any of these, perhaps you have a family member or friend or colleague that might benefit from this. Because remember, if you are here today and you personally are not someone who is experiencing a mental health or substance abuse issue, statistically, odds are somebody in your family or a friend is. And perhaps this information might be helpful to them. And of course, if anyone has any questions or feedback that they would like to share, there's my email address here at CCBC. And I'm going to stop sharing there, and I'm going to go back to our screen. I believe that Sarah had to leave us at 12:30, but I would just like to ask folks, either in the classroom or who are listening in from off campus, if you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Anybody here in the classroom? Oh, Brenda?
Andrea, can you hear me?
Yes, Brenda.
Andrea, I just wanted to say thank you. This is really very interesting, and I appreciate the time and energy you put into it, and I also like how you brought your class into it, so thank you for that.
Oh, thank you, Brenda. I was really grateful for Sarah to ask me to do this in April, because I thought the timing was so significant. And while we all need information, we also need the acknowledgement that we're not alone, and that little hope doesn't hurt anybody. You're quite welcome, Lorraine. Any folks here in the classroom? Okay. Well, I would like to thank everyone, if there's no more questions or comments, for joining us today. I hope at the minimum that I hope you got something out of our presentation today. At the minimum, I hope you got a little mental health break. We all need that now and then. So thanks to everyone, and have a wonderful day.